Almost every day throughout the United States, a community finds out that its water supply or air is contaminated with some dangerous chemical, usually from a nearby industry. And what you almost always hear from the government regulators, who are paid by that community to protect its health, of course, what they almost always say is that the levels of this dangerous chemical in the community's air, in its water supply, are within regulations. They comply with regulations. And the message, of course, from our government regulators when they say those kinds of things is, these concentrations are not going to hurt you. They are, in a word, safe. But I want to tell you, the most important thing I want to tell you in this video is that is not true. Compliance with regulations does not equal safety. Let me give you a dramatic example from American history that proves this point. So we all know that more than 100 years ago, a boat called the Titanic sank. We know that 1,500 people died. We know that 1,500 people died because there weren't enough lifeboats. What a lot of people don't know, and is right on the point that I'm talking about here, is the Titanic had more lifeboats than was required under regulations. Under regulations, it only needed lifeboats for about 1,000 people, right? But there were 2,200 people on board. Not even lifeboats for half the people there, and yet the number of lifeboats complied with the regulations that were current then. People lost their lives despite the fact that there were a regulatorily compliant number of lifeboats. A dramatic example. Why did that happen? It happened because the regulations were written 30 years before the Titanic set sail that night, and they were written for much smaller ships than the Titanic. A very powerful and dramatic example of what goes on even today, which is the regulations that supposedly protect us, that the regulators invoke to tell us that the concentrations in your air and water are safe because they're within regulations, right? Those were oftentimes written many, many years earlier and based on information that is no longer true, based on science that is no longer accepted. I came across a situation like this early in my career. The first polluting chemical that I came into contact with in my very first case was a chemical called trichloroethylene, an industrial solvent, short form TCE. TCE is used to clean the grime off of parts in industry. It's a very dangerous chemical. We now know it to be a real cancer causer, especially dangerous for kids, right? About 70 years ago, though, that same TCE that we now know to be so dangerous was used in dental surgeries as an anesthetic. We thought it was that safe back then, and yet, not even a century later, we know that it kills people. This is the advance of science. We learn more information, we get better science, and we find out how dangerous these chemicals really are. But what it tells us is, oftentimes, our regulations are horribly outdated and they don't protect you. So it's not correct to assume that because the levels of a chemical in your air or water comply with regulations, they are safe. The other point I want to make here is that all of our environmental regulation is driven by a very dangerous and polluter-friendly assumption. And what is that? That chemicals are environment, chemicals used by industry are, quote, safe until proven dangerous, close quote. In other words, throughout our history, this has always been true. It's true today. Most people don't believe it, but it's absolutely true. And that is, a company can go out and use a chemical in its industrial process, emit it into the air or into the water, and not know how dangerous it is, not have to prove first, before it's allowed to expose its neighbors to this chemical, not have to prove that it's not putting their lives in danger. The assumption is that a chemical is safe until proven dangerous. And this is true even for chemicals that we should know just by operation of common sense that they're dangerous. Chemical used to kill things, insecticides, pesticides, sterilants. It's their very job in industry to kill things. And yet we allow them to be emitted out into communities where people breathe them, where people drink them, right? Safe until proven dangerous. It's a governing assumption here that makes our communities very, very dangerous and really puts polluters in control of our safety. And why is that? Because who's going to prove a chemical is dangerous? Who wants to prove a chemical is dangerous? It's people who are exposed to it, people whose lives or health are in danger, right? But oftentimes those are the very people who have no idea that their lives or health are in danger. And it's typically poor people, oftentimes poor minority. They don't have the resources to do the extraordinarily expensive scientific studies that are often required to prove that a certain chemical is dangerous. In Europe, they operate on a different assumption, typically, and that is you have to prove a chemical's safety before you are allowed to unleash it onto a community. We don't operate that way here. And so that assumption, coupled with my first point, which is about how our regulations are based on outdated information and science, are two of the most important reasons why, when someone tells you a chemical or a level of a chemical in your community is within regulations, does not mean it's safe. Compliance with regulation is not something you should trust as the equivalent of safety.